It was around 7 p.m. on a cold winter night, with temperatures dropping to nearly -15 Celsius. I was driving to visit my mom and dad for the holidays. I lived about an hour and a half away from my parents, and it was mostly down a smaller highway through mostly farmland, but there were a few patches of trees as well. It wasn't snowing at the moment, but there was a lot of snow on the ground. The roads were in pretty good shape because the plows had been through since the last real blizzard. The highway was quiet, almost eerily so. There was something peaceful about driving at night, watching the landscape pass by in a blur of shadows and dim light. Although it was only 7, it was pretty much dark. The highway had some lampposts, but there were not many of them. I had to rely on my headlights in between. As I rounded a bend, my car suddenly lost traction. It was spinning out of control. I fought to regain control of the vehicle, but it was no use. The car skidded off the road, coming to a stop in a shallow ditch at the side of the highway. There was a tall lamppost meters away. I was lucky I didn't crash into it. For a few moments, I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm down. I was shaken, but thankfully not hurt. Concerned about my car, I decided to step out and check the damage. The night was bitterly cold. My breath formed little puffs of steam in the air. I walked around my car a few times, and as far as I could tell, it was okay. My tires were half buried in snow, but I was pretty sure there was no damage. It seemed that I might even be able to drive out of there without having to bother calling for help. However, when I looked at the road, a smooth slab of perfect ice caught my attention. It was the strangest thing I had ever seen out there. The roads were cleared and salted the whole way so far, but this one section was an absolute ice rink. It made no sense, so I walked over to get a closer look. When I stepped onto the road, my foot slipped slightly. I caught myself before I fell. It was a solid sheet, like a skating rink. It seemed unnatural the way it stretched across the highway. A thought crossed my mind. Could someone have done that on purpose? It seemed far-fetched, but the ice was so uniform, so perfect. I had never seen anything like it before, and I lived around there for my whole life. As I was standing there at the side of the road, a movement from the corner of my eye caught my attention. 2 men were approaching from the woods lining the road. I watched as they walked towards me. They were about 50 meters away. Then I noticed a black truck that was tucked away off in the bush to the side of the road. At first I thought it might be 2 good Samaritans coming to help, or maybe they spun off the road too and needed my help. But as they got closer, I realized something was off. The men were tall and broad-shouldered, moving at a fast pace towards me. It wasn't their approach that alarmed me though, it was what one of them was carrying. He had some kind of a pipe or a crowbar. Maybe it was a baseball bat, but it was definitely some kind of weapon. I know what you're thinking. They could have been coming to help, but I knew they weren't friendly. The timing was too perfect. Nobody would be waiting there in the cold unless they had some reason to. There were no houses around there, and no reason to be hanging around. Also, their truck looked fine, and it wasn't in a ditch like mine. All that considered, I knew their intentions were bad. I didn't want to wait and find out for sure though, so I turned and ran back to my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the door. I threw myself inside and locked the doors immediately. I glanced out the window and saw the men were still coming. They were close. Starting the car, I prayed I was still able to drive. The engine came to life and it sounded fine. I put the car into gear, praying that I wouldn't spin out again. As I pulled away, the tires slipped on the ice, and for a horrifying moment, I thought I would end up back in the ditch again. But the car found traction and I got away from the ditch. My car slowly crept down the slick ice on the road, and eventually I made it past the slippery section of the highway. When I was a safe distance away, I pulled over to the side of the road and called the police. I was sure enough that something was going on, and if it was nothing, then that ice was certainly enough that there should be a warning. I thought it was a trap, but even if I was being too paranoid, then that stretch of road was really dangerous. The police took my report and asked some follow-up questions. They told me to drive to the nearest town and wait for them there. I followed their instructions and drove carefully, eventually making it to the police station. The officers met me there, and I gave them some more details. They seemed concerned about the icy conditions, but didn't seem to take the rest very seriously. It seemed they didn't believe it was a trap. I could tell they thought I was crazy. One of the officers said something like, "Yeah, the roads can get icy out there." I insisted to him that 2 men approached me as I was out there, and I thought they set me up. He seemed skeptical, but offered to let me take them back to the spot. I agreed, and when we got close, we stopped short of the ice. When the cops saw it, they were basically speechless. They had never seen anything like it either. The sheet of ice was definitely not natural. Although the slick surface remained, there was no sign of the men or the truck that I had seen earlier. I could tell that the police were starting to believe me, but the guys who approached me that night were not found. They must have taken off soon after I got away. There was not much for me to do there, so I took off and headed back on my way. The cops closed down that part of the road until a plow was able to come and salt the area. When I finally got to my parents' house, I told them and my brother the whole story. My dad wanted to go back and check it out, but I convinced him to let the police handle it. I later learned from the police that they had analyzed the spot where I had spun out. They told me the ice was indeed deliberately created. The incident remains an unsolved mystery in my area. It made the news and everything. The police speculated that it could have been an attempted robbery or something even more sinister. Seems like a lot of effort for a robbery. Plus, I could have easily been hurt or killed in the crash, so a simple robbery doesn't really make sense. It must have been more than that. When I was around 8 years old, my family lived in a small townhouse in the city. I had a younger brother who was 3 at the time. Our neighbors to the left were the Hensons. We didn't know them well, but they had 2 kids who were around high school age, a little too old to be friends with me. We would see them around, but that was about it. I wouldn't say that their parents were friends with mine either. They seemed alright though, at first anyway. It was a cold December evening. It was Christmas Eve actually, and our house was decorated for the occasion, just like any other year. I always loved the decorations, especially the Christmas tree. My parents had allowed me to sleep in the living room that night because I wanted to be close to it. That was a habit that I started when I was younger. I think originally that I was trying to catch Santa. At 8 years old though, I didn't really believe anymore. It was more about make-believe at that point. I didn't actually believe, but I still kind of pretended, and I would act like I did. Everyone else had gone to bed, and I was lying on the couch wrapped in my favorite blanket. The lights of the Christmas tree were casting colorful shadows around the room. There were blinking LED lights, so it was safe to leave them on all night. I remember feeling so happy as I drifted off to sleep. I don't remember when, but at some point I dozed off. But in the middle of the night, I was startled awake by a sound. It was the sound of the back door creaking open. At first, in my half-asleep state, I thought it might be Santa. But then I woke up a little more and realized that it couldn't be. I knew that my parents would sneak downstairs at some point to put presents under the tree, so I thought it must have been them. Why they were outside, I didn't know. However, when I looked over to the tree, there were piles of wrapped gifts that were not there when I went to sleep. My parents had already been there, so I was confused. Then I heard someone approaching the living room. I sat up rubbing my eyes, and that's when I saw him. A man entered the living room and stood in the doorway. He was swaying back and forth, and I could hear him breathing loudly. It was our neighbor Mr. Henson, and he was standing in our living room. He looked strange and scary. His clothing was disheveled, his hair was a mess, and his eyes looked wild. I froze in fear, unable to move or speak. He staggered a few steps towards me, mumbling something that I couldn't understand. My heart was pounding so loudly that I thought it might burst out of my chest. I pulled the blanket over my head, thinking that would protect me somehow. Then I found my voice, and I screamed as loud as I could for my parents. In what felt like seconds, but it might have been a bit longer, my parents burst into the room. My dad immediately moved towards Mr. Henson, while my mom rushed towards me, pulling me into her arms. "What are you doing in our house?" I heard my dad demand, in a stern, angry voice. Mr. Henson seemed confused, looking around as if he didn't know where he was. He mumbled something about being sorry, but he was hard to understand. He then stumbled out of the room, and I heard the front door open and then close. I was glad he was gone. My mom was holding me tight, whispering that everything was going to be okay, but I couldn't stop shaking. My dad grabbed the phone and dialed the police. They arrived shortly and spoke to my parents. Then they went to Mr. Henson's house. I still have no idea how that conversation went, but I did look out our front window, and he was being arrested. The officers took him away, and he was charged with public intoxication and breaking and entering. After the cops left, my parents did their best to calm me down. They checked all the doors and windows to make sure they were locked. That night I slept in my parents' room, with my younger brother too. There were 3 bedrooms in that house, but we all crammed into one. For the following days, we didn't see Mr. Henson again, but eventually he returned to our neighborhood. As you can imagine, it was a very awkward and creepy experience living near that guy. He never spoke to us again, and never even apologized for what he did. Their family moved away less than a year later, and the whole neighborhood was really happy when that happened. Everyone knew what he did, and nobody wanted him around anymore. One thing about that incident still confuses me though. Mr. Henson came through our back door, which was always locked. When we checked the door the next day, it was completely fine. No damage, no scratches, nothing. My dad even had a locksmith come to inspect it, and it was totally fine. We still have no idea how he got into our house without breaking anything. Maybe someone forgot to lock the door, or maybe Mr. Henson was an expert lockpicker. But what I think is that he got a key to our house somehow. Perhaps that wasn't the first time he'd let himself into our place. Maybe I'm reading a little too much into this, but I think we had a pretty serious stalker in our neighborhood. We could never prove it though, so it remains nothing more than a theory, but it still nags at me to this day. Last Christmas, my family and I rented a cabin in the woods for a week. It was a picturesque little place looking like something straight out of a holiday postcard. There were 5 of us, my parents, my 2 sisters, and myself. I'm 38, and my sisters are a year and 2 years younger than me. We've been looking forward to this for several months. We imagined spending the evenings around the fire, and just generally enjoying each other's company. I don't live in the same city as them, so we usually try to make Christmas the time where we all get together. The cabin was quite rustic, but it did have power and running water. It was, however, heated by a wood stove in the middle of the room. There would have been nothing stopping the owners from putting in electrical heating, but I guess they thought that would take away from the charm. There was actually a small electric space heater, but it wasn't enough for the whole place. We did need to keep the wood stove going in order for the cabin to be warm enough. There were 2 bedrooms in the place. My parents took the big one, and my 2 sisters shared the other. I was left with the couch, which was right in front of the wood stove. The first few days were just as wonderful as we had hoped. We went on walks during the day, and in the evenings, we talked in the living room. On the 3rd night, we had just finished dinner, and we were settling in for the evening. We all went to bed as usual, but in the middle of the night, I woke up. I thought I heard something outside, but I wasn't sure if it was a dream. I was on edge, and I couldn't fall back to sleep. The fire in the stove was a smoldering pile of hot coals. Even still, I began to notice the cabin was slowly filling with smoke. I wasn't sure at first, but as the smoke grew thicker, it became clear that something was wrong. I quickly extinguished the fire, while the rest of my family was still asleep. I stayed up all night sitting on the couch, and when everybody got up, the temperature in the cabin had dropped significantly. The weather outside was well below freezing, and without the wood stove, the cabin's interior rapidly began to cool down. When my family got up, they were all curious about why the fire was out. I explained to them that something must have blocked the chimney, and I had to put it out. We bundled up in blankets and extra layers of clothing in the meantime. The small electric heater helped, but it was still cold. I thought it was just a tree branch, and I told everyone that I would check it out. I had some experience with wood stoves, and I knew that a blockage in the chimney could cause smoke to back up into the house. I started by checking the stove itself, which seemed to be working fine. The problem had to be in the chimney. I put on my jacket and went outside to check the chimney on the roof. The climb to the roof was tricky. The ladder was slippery with ice. When I reached the chimney, I found the source of the problem. The metal cover that was supposed to be open to let the smoke out was closed. That struck me as odd, because I clearly remembered seeing it open when we first arrived. When I tried to flip it back open, I noticed that it was secured with a small piece of wire twisted to lock it. It then dawned on me that somebody must have closed it intentionally, but who would do such a thing, and why? It was a disturbing thought. We were quite isolated, with the nearest neighbors a good distance away. I knew someone had to be up there, but by the time I noticed, I had already walked around on the roof enough to disturb any footprints. It was impossible to tell the difference between mine and anyone else's. I opened the cover, securing it in place to prevent it from closing again. As I climbed back down, I noticed a trail of footprints on the ground leading between the dense woods and the cabin. I told my family what I found, and we all agreed that it didn't feel safe to stay any longer, especially considering the possibility that someone was lurking around. We quickly packed our belongings, loaded up the car, and left the cabin. The drive back home was quiet. Each of us was lost in our thoughts. Once home, we contacted the cabin's owner to inform them of what happened. They were as baffled as we were and promised to look into it. However, we never got a clear answer about who might have closed the chimney cover or why. I'm 25 now, but this happened when I was 10 years old. I'm an only child, and so are both of my parents, so our family is quite small. Outside of my parents, I only have my grandparents on my father's side. Every year at Christmas, we would drive to visit them. Since they were getting up there in age, the 4-hour trip was a little more than they could handle, especially in the winter weather. We packed the car with gifts and set off for the journey. If I had my way, we would have stayed home, but it wasn't my call. I was excited to see my grandparents, though. I was sitting in the back seat listening to music. My mom was in the front passenger seat, and my dad was driving. About halfway through the trip, we stopped at a gas station to refuel and stretch our legs. My parents got out to pay for the gas and grab a coffee, leaving me in the car. I didn't need to get out to use the bathroom, so I stayed inside. It was well below freezing, and I didn't feel like stepping out into the cold. I was scrolling through my iPod when I noticed a man walking towards our car. He looked out of place at the gas station. The man was not dressed for the weather. He was wearing a black leather jacket and jeans with no hat. He stopped by my window and tapped on it, and I could see that he started talking. I couldn't hear him clearly through the closed window, but I felt weird about his presence. He gestured for me to roll down the window, but I shook my head, not willing to open myself up to a stranger. He persisted for a bit. I didn't know what to think about it, but I was uncomfortable. Just then, my parents came out of the gas station. As soon as the man saw them, he quickly walked away, disappearing between the parked cars. My parents got back into our car. My dad asked me who that man was, and I told him I didn't know. He seemed concerned, and my parents even discussed calling the police, but by that time, he was gone. We tried to move past it, and we continued our journey. We drove for another hour without incident, but then I noticed a car that seemed to be following us. It was a common model, but something about it seemed familiar. I mentioned it to my parents, and we all started paying more attention. The car maintained a constant distance behind us, taking every turn we did. There was a while where it could have been a coincidence, but then we made another stop so I could go to the bathroom. The car followed us. I went into the washroom and my dad came with me. On the way back to the car, I saw the man from before. It was definitely him. He had parked his car illegally near the entrance to the rest stop and was sitting in his car smoking a cigarette. I don't think my dad noticed, and I was too scared to say anything. We got back into the car and hit the road again. It was only an hour to my grandparents' place, and I was eager to get there. On the way, I kept looking out the back window, but the car from before was nowhere to be seen. I thought we lost him, or maybe he gave up. As we approached my grandparents' neighborhood, I had forgotten about that guy who was following us. We were all looking forward to getting there and being out of the car, but as we got into their small street, my heart sank. There was that same car, the one who had been following us, slowly driving past my grandparents' house. We were about 2 hours from the first place where we saw him. What kind of psycho would do that, just to follow some random family? My dad parked our car, and we quickly went inside, locking the door behind us. I know you might be thinking that it was all a coincidence, or that it was in my head, and I don't blame you, but what happened the next day can't be explained away so easily. We spent the night there, as we always did. The next morning, my dad went out to the car to get something from the store. He came back into the house immediately and called the police. I then found out that somebody had slashed the tires on our car at some point in the night. I have no doubt that it was the creep who followed us. My grandparents live in a quiet neighborhood, where crime is almost non-existent. Things like that simply don't happen there. When the police were on the line, my dad did the talking. Some officers came out and checked out the damage. They took some pictures of the slashed tires, but there wasn't much real evidence. My grandparents didn't have security cameras. None of their neighbors did either. Since our car was out on the driveway, any footprints or tire tracks would have been buried by the dusting of snow that came in the morning. My dad spent that day on the phone trying to find someone to replace the damaged tires. We ended up spending an extra 2 days there because of what happened. Eventually we left and drove back home. I was worried that whole day that the psycho guy would run us off the road, but we didn't see him again. I still have no idea what his problem was, but he was definitely crazy. My sister's 2 years older than me. I was approximately 15 when this occurred, so she was probably 17. It was Christmas Eve, either 2004 or 2005, and we were stuck at my grandmother's house in Michigan. My grandmother was at her home in Florida, but my family stayed at her Michigan house to be near our other family in that area for the holiday. It was painfully boring that night, and my parents had gone out to dinner with other adults. That meant it was just me, my sister, and our little brother who was approximately 5 years old at the time. I remember putting my brother to bed and going to sit on the couch so I could plug my new laptop into the internet. Suddenly, my sister was in the living room yelling, "Get out of my spot." She wanted the internet plug. I don't know what I said, but I'm sure I didn't want to give up the internet spot without a fight. Nothing was physical, but the yelling woke my brother. I put him back to bed and returned to the living room/kitchen area. At that point, my sister was in the kitchen. She looked at me, apologized, and offered me the internet plug. I was surprised, because she never apologizes. But after all that, I decided to go to bed and spend the rest of the night texting my boyfriend. I cautiously accepted her apology, but declined the internet plug. She then proceeded to try to convince me to sit there. When I reiterated that I was going to bed, it was like a switch went off. She didn't say anything, but I could see it in her eyes. Those eyes changed, and suddenly they were focused on the butcher block of knives. The next thing I knew, she was reaching for the knives, which were between us. I grabbed the Windex bottle that happened to be next to me and sprayed her in the face between turning and running down the hallway. As I ran, I could hear her yelling at me and coming down the hallway too. I went into the first room I came across, which was a bathroom, and I locked the door. Within seconds, she was banging on the door. I called my parents and told my sister that they were coming. For 10 minutes, she tried to break down the door, but suddenly there was silence. What broke the silence was her voice apologizing again. This time I knew better and stayed away. When my parents arrived, there was a butcher's knife under a couch pillow directly in front of the bathroom in which I was hiding. It was then that I realized that the internet spot she wanted to give me faced away from the kitchen. I have no doubt that she planned to kill me.